explain it. So along those same lines, we're now going to have a panel where we're going to discuss all of these technological terms and give you a full overview of automated decision systems and the technology terms that you'll hear today. So please join me in welcoming Rashida Richardson and Dr. Ruha Benjamin.
You guys hear us?
Yeah.
Can you guys hear us? Yeah. You just did an interactive activity. I'm supposed to wake you up. Icebreaker didn't work? Okay, there we go. So, as you know, I'm Katurah Tops, and I will let Rashida and Ruha introduce themselves and give you a little bit about their background before we get started.
We'll switch. Hi, I'm Rashida Richardson. I'm the Director of Policy Research at the AI Now Institute, which is an interdisciplinary institute based at NYU, and we research the social implications of artificial intelligence. My background is as a civil rights lawyer, and I'll be in some of the breakout sessions, but a lot of what we are talking about today are the things that I research and work with a lot of people in the room on advocacy efforts here in New York City and around the country and globe.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon by now. My name is Ruha Benjamin. I'm an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton and the founder of the Just Data Lab at Princeton, and the author of a book called Race After Technology. And just acknowledging the brilliance and the work that's gone into this day, I just want us to give a round of applause to these two individuals here, Rashida and Katurah. Without whom I don't think we'd be sitting in this room today. So thank you both so much for your work.
Of course, and it's a collaborative effort, as always. So let's just get started. We've been here now just about an hour or so, and we've already heard terms like automated decision systems, algorithmic bias, algorithms in general. Can you guys just explain what is algorithmic bias and what is an automated decision system?
So an automated decision system is a technology or a math-based technical approach that uses vast amounts of data, and that's both government and private data. So it can be information from like Uber, Lyft, and like the city bikes things, as well as government information. So the what Nicole just described about risk assessments that would come from New York City, NYPD, or the Correctional Services data. And it's used to inform, help, or supplant government decision-making, and it can help with predicting something. So I'll give an example after that, giving scores or other types of analysis. So that's you can see the definition up there. So to give a real-world example of how this plays out, a technology that is used here in New York City called predictive policing is used to predict where a crime may occur or who may be a victim or a perpetrator of a crime. And it's used by the NYPD, and they rely on NYPD data, so we'll look at prior arrest data, aggregate data about where crime is occurring, which can come from 311 calls or from NYPD stops, as well as other non-law enforcement data like the weather or where a sports event is happening, and other things that may make you go, about how it relates to crime, but it's used to help predict crime in those instances. And the way that it's applied to help or supplant government decision-making is that police departments will use the predictions of these systems to decide where cops will go to walk the beat, or they'll even go to people. So this was an example in Chicago where they went and knocked on people's doors and was like, you're on a list. Not much context was given to people, but it was because they were on a list for possibly being a victim or a perpetrator of a gun-related crime, and weren't given much context on how that was being used, but it was being used by the law enforcement department to decide where they were going to go and who was going to be subjected to more inquiry by the police. And then I'll hand it to Ruha for
No, that's a great example. Okay, so Rashida, let's just break it down a little bit. You gave the example of predictive policing as a form of using automated decision systems. So what is wrong with a police department taking the data that it has and using that to determine where crime will happen or where they should go?
So part of the problem is because it's relying on historical data, and that's a twofold problem in that if it's relying on law enforcement data, it's not actually reflecting the occurrence of crime. So a lot of the times it's just reflecting police practices and policies. So if we look here at New York City, where we all know the NYPD engaged in racially biased stop and frisk practices for over a decade, if that information is imported into a system and given the awe of objective fact, then it's going to just predict that black and brown people commit more crimes when we all know that's not the truth. But the problem there is that it's reflecting the NYPD's practices, not actually where a crime occurred. And another problem is that even the non-law enforcement data is not very objective. So some of the examples I gave of weather or sporting events, that those are based on criminology research, which is kind of arbitrary, or based on sort of old school views about crime, but also information like 311 calls is something that's not very objective. And recently there was an organization in New York that looked at 311 data and found that in neighborhoods that were recently gentrifying, so an influx of whiter and affluent residents, not only saw an increase in 311 calls, but the outcomes of those 311 calls ended in arrest or a stop were 3 times as more likely. And that's mostly because of what we're now seeing as more prevalent of like the barbecue Beckies, and where we see people calling the police for non-criminal behavior that they just suspect as criminal or something that makes them feel uncomfortable. And when that's someone who the law enforcement department respects or takes their information as truth, that then becomes a fact that's used in the system and becomes perpetuated over time. So when you hear throughout the day us talk about bias in and bias out, or garbage in and garbage out, it's really talking about what is the problem with the data that's being used, whose worldview is being projected by that data, and how is that affecting all of us.
And so would this be dirty data?
Yes, so dirty data.
Yeah.
Thanks for the leading question. So dirty data is a term that comes from the data mining community, and it relates to skews or other inaccuracies in data. So as I suggested with the stop and frisk data, those were not actual indications of crime, but that was flawed data that was taken as fact. But then you could also just have input data put in wrong. So if a date or even the name of a person is input wrong, then that is also a form of a skew. So there's many ways that you could have information that is seen as objective fact that actually is flawed.
Okay, so basically you have all of this dirty data. You have a society that we all know has racially discriminatory practices, systemic racism that's going on, and those practices are all incorporated into the data, which is why we have dirty data.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing is like, one of the problems with a lot of these systems is it's not so much that it's always using bad data, but it's actually reflecting our society. We don't live in an equal world. We don't live in a society where we're all treated the same. So when you even have data that's reflecting the biased practices that exist, these systems are going to project that in the same way that they exist in the world.
And then on the outset, you have technology that's going to replicate those same racially discriminatory practices. So we've seen many examples of that, and we'll probably get into a few more later. But Dr. Ruha, can you speak a little bit about the historical context from the harms that we're seeing today to maybe the harms that we have experienced before? Is there any connection between those two?
Sure, and I'll just say the reason for even, I think, for us to reflect together about the historical precedents to this conversation is not just to have a history lesson, but to understand that the problems we face today, people have faced versions of this before and have built movements and built power to counter it. So it's an effort not to let this information make us paranoid, but as my activist colleagues say, to help us build our power in reaction. And so to really get a sense, especially the role of New York and New York sort of law in this longer history of surveillance and technology, we have to go back to 1713. In 1713, the Common Council of the City of New York, which is the precursor of today's City Council, approved what they called a law for regulating Negro and Indian slaves in the nighttime. It was a lantern law, and it required any enslaved individual or indigenous individual older than 14 years old to carry a light, unless they were in the company of a white person, so that they could be easily identified, and most importantly, so that you could keep track of whether groups of people were assembling. Which in just that part alone tells us the danger and the power of collective assembly. That you had to pass a whole law and employ technologies in order to surveil that collective assembly. My colleague, who's written a fantastic book called Dark Matters, Simone Brown, she puts it plainly. She says, surveillance is nothing new to black folks. From slave ships and slave patrols to airport security checkpoints and stop and frisk policing practices. She points to the facticity of surveillance in black life. And this is not just a practice in the US, but we can look globally. We can look at how different societies have employed technology, have employed automated systems in order to advance social control and racial control. We know, for example, the Nazi regime collaborated with the company IBM to create punch cards in order to tabulate, calculate, and control unwanted, denigrated populations as a precursor to genocide. And what's really interesting about this context is that so many different kinds of people were complicit, not simply those who were carrying out the obvious genocide, but people who were just clocking into work. One author calls it the bureaucracy of evil. The bureaucracy of evil, where you don't have to have malicious intent in order to carry out an unjust system and to be complicit in it. So as we begin to think anew about how these historical lessons apply today, one of the first things we have to begin to do is understand that indifference to social reality, just doing our job, can advance very dangerous and evil practices. We don't have to individually feel malicious intent or hatred towards someone in order to advance this. And so indifference is a powerful force that we have to start to begin to wrap our heads around. Now, the historical lesson isn't just about the harms, but it's also about the resistance, the reimagining, the way in which people have begun to push back against these practices. And so we have to go to Brother Martin, who said, we have guided missiles and misguided men. Automated weapons on the one hand, but automation more broadly. We have guided systems and misguided people. He said, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism are incapable of being conquered. And so this is a tradition we have to build on, where people who care about justice also care deeply about the role of technology in either enabling harmful, dangerous, oppressive processes or being retaken and used for liberatory ends. And so this is a tradition we have to build on.
Wow, that was... I think we could just stop right there, right? I'm glad you brought that up, though, because we often hear, as a defense to automated decision systems and technological use, that it's objective, right? That it's neutral. Well, it's technology. It's not intentionally racist. How can technology be racist? But Rashida just explained how adding all of this dirty data into these systems and coupling that with our society, who definitely is struggling, right? That yields discriminatory results. So it's not sufficient enough to just say we're using neutral technology, because in fact the technology isn't neutral, the society isn't neutral, and then you have to consider the actors. So yeah, I was going to say, can you guys actually give us some concrete examples of how this technology has harmed us right now?
Well, okay.
Oh, go back. Go ahead.
So I wanted to add another point to trying to unpack the neutrality, because I think it's also important. It's not all of us in the room that are making these technologies. It's a limited few of companies, but also people. It's mostly white men that are making a lot of these technologies, and you have to think about what is a technology when the worldview is from a very small segment of society that has one view. So in the example of predictive policing, if people have a view that Black people are inherently more criminal and commit more crimes, then you have a system that's developed with that type of worldview that's then being imported into police departments. So you have to think about the layers of not only what is the data reflecting in these technologies, but also who's making the decisions about what is crime, who's a criminal, and then how is that being imported into how these systems are designed. But examples.
Well, I agree with, and I would just say one thing, and I think that underscores the whole point of this forum today, right? You have to have different viewpoints. You have to have community members. You have to have people who are going to be impacted by these systems in the room making those decisions. Okay, go ahead.
So some examples. I will note that outside we have a bunch of different charts. There's one chart that lists surveillance technologies used by the NYPD, as well as a list of automated decision systems that we know are used in New York City, as well as those used in other jurisdictions that could be used here, but we lack transparency to know. So some of the harms that we know are in a range of areas. Education is one that's very contentious in the system, in that the DOE uses a school assignment algorithm to place students in schools, and while that may seem fairly objective, where you go to school can really change your trajectory in life. And if you don't know the factors, as we've discussed already, that are being used by these systems, or if everyone doesn't have equal access to information, you end up with New York City having the most segregated schools in the country, as we currently do. I already mentioned predictive policing, but we also have other surveillance technologies like facial recognition, which are used not only by the police, but it's now increasingly being used in social domains like housing and in schools. Actually, in Lockport, upstate New York, there's a school district that has now installed a facial recognition system for the entry into their schools. Then you have really dramatic examples. This isn't one in New York City, but can easily happen here. But in Michigan, there's a pending case where over 40,000 people were improperly flagged for committing welfare fraud. And Michigan, unfortunately, has a high penalty rate, so all of those people received fines of up to $10,000, and many of them had to file for bankruptcy and many other consequences. But that's something where it's increasingly being used by public benefits administrations for not only SNAP benefits, Medicaid, Medicare, and other public benefits, but
Was this a technology that flagged it?
Yeah, and this was a technology and automated decision system. And these are, I'll stop because I could keep going. But these are a few examples where if you think about any type of decision that government's making or influencing in your life, whether it's where you go to school, whether you receive benefits, where you can live, all of these rely on data and can have technologies that are being either influenced or solely making the decisions by themselves.
I'll give two quick examples from the context of healthcare and hiring, because that affects all of us in some way. So about a month ago, the results of a study were published, in which some colleagues of mine looked at a healthcare algorithm that's used widely throughout the US, affecting about 100 million people. And this algorithm produced by a company called Optum flags individuals who it predicts are going to need more healthcare attention, more than the average patient. And what my colleagues found is that the algorithm dramatically underestimated the health needs of the sickest Black patients, amplifying long-standing racial disparities. And that they calculated correcting for the bias that would more than double the number of Black patients flagged for healthcare attention. And what's really interesting about this study is that the algorithm does not explicitly take note of patients' race, that it is a race-neutral decision system. and yet it reproduces long-standing healthcare disparities based on race. And to understand why that is, you can read the original study or my review of it, which is on the research tab of my website. I won't get into the weeds here. I'll also point out in the context of hiring, there are a number of companies developing AI-powered recruitment tools that help human resource offices decide who to flag as a desirable hire and who to reject. And many of these companies are positing themselves as not only faster, more efficient than their human counterparts, but also promising to be less biased because they're not going to keep track, again, of race or gender or other forms of discriminatory status assignments. But in fact, if we look at the way that these algorithms play out, they often replicate human biases. And so some colleagues of mine, computer scientists at Princeton, studied a natural language processing algorithm, an algorithm that learns from human writing online. And what they found was interesting because it echoed a classic audit study based on old school resumes that was done some years ago. And this algorithm associated black names, people's names, with negative qualities and white names with positive qualities, which builds on a classic audit study that sent out resumes to thousands of employers, and all the qualifications were the same on the resumes except the names were different. And employers responded positively to those white names, and the algorithm does the same. And so we have to question how both the training data, the design of the algorithms, posit themselves as neutral and objective, and yet often replicate these long-standing biases.
Wow. And so for that example that you just gave, that technology, that algorithm, was not ever explicitly told that black names were negative and that white names were positive.
Exactly. It was learning from the associations that people make in our writing online.
I think that's just another indication of why even when we see algorithms and we get behind the hood and we get to really understand what's put into them, we have to be rigorous about making sure we understand who created them and who was there, because this is an example of how you don't really need to explicitly ever have anything that's racist, but there are these proxy factors that lead to discriminatory results. So you guys talked about how technology has harmed us in healthcare, education, policing, financially as well, in all areas of our lives. If this is happening so frequently, why aren't government agencies stopping this? Why is it still allowed?
Because there's not much regulation, and that's why Action Hour is really going to matter today. But one thing I'll note is that governments are increasingly turning to these types of systems for a number of reasons. Sometimes they suggest that it's cost savings and that it will save money to help implement these systems, it will save time, or it will increase resource allocation. So the example I always use with predictive policing is that some police departments that have really small forces may try to figure out how can we get our department to cover the whole area, knowing that we may only have 12 officers on duty at a time. And as Ruha suggested, sometimes they're also implemented as de-biasing mechanisms. So in departments that have a history of discriminatory practices or some type of bias, they'll adopt these tools thinking they're more objective because they're based on data and not things like intuition or gut instinct. But in fact, as we've already discussed, these systems not only bake in the bias, but they also tend to conceal what's going on under the hood.
Can either of you speak to what New York City leadership is doing to ensure algorithms are unbiased and transparent?
So, unfortunately, we have a mixed bag here in New York City. Recently, a task force, the Automated Decision System Task Force, released a report that was not that interesting to read, but you can find it online. And they spent about a year and a half. The expectation is that they were going to review systems that were used in the city and develop recommendations about what information should the public know, what standards should be in place or processes be in place if they're producing discriminatory outcomes, as well as more technical recommendations, and that didn't happen. But a lot of us in the room have been pushing back to that effort, and earlier this week we released a shadow report that included more robust recommendations about what city agencies should do. And there's also two bills that are before the City Council that will push for more transparency. One of them being the POST Act, which would require the NYPD to release information about the surveillance technologies they're using, and another is more explicit about the mayor collecting information about the automated decision systems being used in the city. So even though a lot of what we're saying is kind of scary or maybe concerning, there's a lot that can happen, and I think it's really important for your city council members and the mayor to hear from you and know that you're concerned about these systems. You should actually know. You shouldn't have to come to a public forum to learn about what's happening in your communities. And this is a first step in getting action. I think we need to know what's in use so we can have broader community conversation, and then we can start to draw lines in the sand about which technologies do we think should never be used in our communities and which ones can be used and may have some benefits but require greater regulation, and who should be making those decisions. And a lot of that is unknown right now, but I think our elected officials need to hear from us so that way they see this as a pressing issue and something needs to happen now.
I fully agree. Agreed. And Rashida's teasing a little bit about the action hour because obviously we are not going to leave you guys hanging. We fully agree that the community needs to speak out and make sure that New York City leadership knows. De Blasio needs to know. Your city councilors need to know. Everyone needs to understand that this is an issue that impacts all of us, and New York City residents aren't sitting calmly and just letting this happen. So I think with that, we will open the room up for some questions. We have about 5 to 7 minutes for some Q&A. We have volunteers around with microphones who will be raising their hands. I think we have a question over there.
I always stand up because I'm not too loud anyway, even with a mic. But no, I wanted to comment or point out something about your reference to the United Healthcare, Optum healthcare study. So that has implications also for housing discrimination, because it's important for people fighting housing discrimination to look at that specific study, because the recent proposed regulations by HUD would enable the so-called industry standard for in housing, companies doing ratings for housing, the housing market, basically, to make it simple. They can use industry standards as justification. That study shows a good counterexample. But I'm mostly concerned about healthcare and healthcare for people with disabilities. So really, that study, I think, what's the headlines afterwards, and maybe you could comment on this. So the headlines afterwards were showing a quick fix, and those researchers sort of almost enabled United Healthcare to basically say, we got a quick fix. The good thing about the details of their research is it allows people to look at what were the specific kind of health comorbidities, multiple medical problems for people with in specific racial groups, and that they were underserved. And we need to get to that. And I want to call people's attention to how badly we're going backwards in New York State with developmental disabilities and the assessment there, because we're hiding more and more, just like you said, what those proxy measures are, what those details are of the health needs being identified in that assessment. So if you could elaborate a little bit more of your take on that, it would help.
Sure.
Yeah, so really, I'll give you the nutshell response, and we can talk more throughout the afternoon. But first, to the housing context, I think one of the things in terms of the HUD rule, one of the ways to think about it is it's enabling an algorithmic alibi for discrimination. As long as you can point to an algorithmic decision that is advancing the discriminatory practice, then it lets actual realtors or housing developers or others off the hook. So we need to look at that really closely, and it doesn't just apply to housing, but the way that algorithmic decisions allow for an alibi out of accountability. And what we're trying to actually advance is a much deeper, robust accountability. In terms of the actual healthcare study, and it also relates to the hiring algorithms, what's the kind of paradox in both of those is that the automated decision system grows out of a context in which people are having more awareness and acknowledgement of the existing biases among humans, and also, in the case of healthcare, an attempt to save money and save costs. So it grows out of a context of cost savings and acknowledgement of bias, but then the turn to technology and algorithms as a quick fix, as a technical fix, rather than dealing with the underlying causes of the problems is where we make a wrong turn. And so I would co-sign the point that you made, and I hope that these points actually infuse our conversation today.
And just a little context for those that don't know about the HUD rulemaking, that's the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. And earlier this year, around August through October, they issued a rulemaking, which is something that then can become law, that provided a number of defenses to landlords or even banks that use algorithmic systems and may have a racial bias, and it pretty much said you get a get out of jail for free card. So that's what we're talking about, is that it's possible that this can become law, so using a system, even if it does produce a racial bias, will be allowed. So this is why you should learn more.
Mm-hmm. And just going back to the historic context, we've seen constant racial discrimination in the housing context, and this is just a reiteration of those same discriminatory tendencies. I think we had a question over there.
Yep. The concern I would have, as I was doing some research, is that Google is partnering with Stanford and Citigroup in warring to consumer finance. How concerned we should be in regards to automated decision systems, in regards to consumer credit and banking and student loans. I mean, this thing is like a panacea. It's growing, and it's like really getting out of control.
Yeah, so a lot of the examples we gave are focused on government because that's something that there's legislation and activity around here. But what you're talking about is also in the private sector, and the examples that Ruha gave are similar in that they exhibit the same problems. So if we know that there's been a history of credit scores having a racial bias, and you're using the same data but automating it over time, yes, it's going to produce a biased outcome, and the same in many other sectors. So yes, we should be concerned, and there's an increased use and reliance on these systems because of this point that we keep making about data being seen as objective. There's a term called automation bias, where we all presume that because it's based on data, it's therefore fairer or not biased. But the reality is, if that data is reflecting the societal biases we have, or reflecting historical bias practices, or even just embedded with proxies where it may seem racially neutral but correlates with race, gender, or socioeconomic status in some way, it's going to produce the same flawed outcomes.
I think we have a question there.
Good afternoon. Thank you. This has been such a great, insightful panel. And I am very interested in seeing how government uses data for good and for public policy making based on the evidence they're gathering from data. In particular, I'm really interested right now on criminal justice reform and how can we perhaps use some of the data for good outcomes in alternative sentencing specifically. And I wanted to see if you have come across other examples of using emerging technology like AR and VR for training, and the data that's coming out of that, and whether that's also giving us insight into bias. And so how can we take the data that's already being collected, and how can we use it for good in solving problems like healthcare and criminal justice reform?
So this is why I emphasize that point about who's making the technologies and whose worldviews are going into the problems that are being solved. And I think that's why you see more of these not so great examples and not ones actually addressing the problems that we know exist. So I think that's why more of us need to be engaged, because there are, even if the data reflects societal biases we know exist, that can help with a lot of advocacy in these areas. So an example I give to kind of paint this picture in predictive policing is that we don't even have a head count on how many predictive policing systems are used, but there's only one pilot study that's using law enforcement data to predict which law enforcement officers are likely to have an adverse interaction with a resident. And we know that police misconduct is a huge problem in this country, and that's something where you can use the data that is reflecting police practices and problems to address the problems that we know exist, but part of the issue is that those interests aren't being represented in vendors or in technology companies. Those aren't the problems we're trying to solve, and that's why we need to start advocating for the use in better areas, and that's also why we're not anti-technology here. I think there are great ways to use data-driven technologies to solve actual problems. The issue is we're not using them to solve the problems that we know exist.
Another concrete example I'd give that is emblematic of, I would say, a genre of solutions that I support is called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. And what's crucial here is thinking about not just using existing data to then, solve some problem, but thinking about the question that data is supposed to answer and that the technology is supposed to solve, and who gets to pose that question. So the question can be, let's figure out who's a risky tenant versus who is a landlord who is likely to evict at a higher rate. Both of those questions are in the context of housing, but point the direction, the lens in very different ways. One, focusing on those who have more power and influence in a context versus those who are painted as risky, but for whom risk is produced by dominant institutions. So in part, what we want to begin to do is, in addition to who's behind the scenes, who's designing the technology, where the data has come from, is to really reclaim the space of problem posing. Whose problems are these technologies and this data supposed to solve? And if it's not at the community level, if people don't have the power to define the problems which these systems are supposedly supposed to solve, then I think we're giving lip service to things like inclusion and equity rather than really enacting them.
So we are out of time. I'll take one more question, and then we'll have a hard stop. Brief question.
Thank you so much. So we've talked a lot about how good intentions can lead to concrete harm. People generally implement these things, facial recognition in school, to improve safety. And then when someone points out the harm that can cause, there's often a response that is, "Nuh-uh, we're race blind," or "we're gender blind," and it sets up a conflict. Are there concrete examples or case studies where people have come on side and said, let's solve this together, and let's address this unintended bias that we have inside ourselves and create a better product to achieve the good intention that was originally there?
It's not quite, this example I'm going to give you is not quite in that narrative vein that people come together and solve the problem, but it is an example of a community taking back their power to define how government actually operates and uses technology. So in the context of St. Paul, Minnesota a few years ago, the public schools joined forces with the police under the rubric of what they called the Innovation Project. And this was a project that was supposed to use predictive techniques to identify at-risk youth in the city, which was immediately a red flag for many residents and community organizations. Over 20 local community organizations worked together for over a year to push back against this innovation project and actually develop a more community-led approach to supporting youth that didn't necessarily rely on new data or new techniques. And so part of what we want to decide, going back to a really crucial point Rashida made is what technologies and what sort of automated systems do we just not want at all, which ones need more regulation, and where in some cases we know how to solve problems that don't necessarily require new technologies if we have the power and resources to do so. So just because there's a problem doesn't mean that there has to be a technical fix for that problem. We have old school ways of addressing things in our communities that also needs to be on the table. And in the context of St. Paul, they decided, you know what, if we have the power and resources, we know how to support youth. And first and foremost, we don't need to label them at risk to get the job done. And so that's a great example where they got a stop to that so-called innovation project and then developed a more community-led approach to do that. And I think that they're developing a model that can be used in other locales in order to, in some ways, track the trackers, and what we're trying to do here in New York, know what ADS systems exist, and then develop community power in order to move the needle forward. Excellent.
Can you guys join me in giving our panelists a hand? That was amazing, very amazing. So we are gonna keep moving right along in the schedule. Oh, wow, not bad at all, timing-wise. Okay, so next we're gonna have a 10-minute break. And this break is gonna give you an opportunity to go out, get a snack, refresh while we set up the breakout sessions. Please listen very carefully. This room will be converted into 6 breakout sessions. You can see the signs on the walls of which sections they will be. I'm going to list them for you right now. The purpose of these breakout sessions is to give you an opportunity to sit down with experts, specialists, and community members who are already working and looking at these particular areas. Dr. Ruha and Rashida listed a number of different areas where technology is impacting communities, and so this will allow you to look at those closely. The areas are digital surveillance, child welfare, education, pretrial detention and risk assessment as one, employment, immigration, housing, and predictive policing. Those are the 8 breakout groups. If you have an agenda, they're also listed on your agenda. So decide which breakout groups you want to go to. You will have an opportunity to go to 2. Each breakout group will be 30 minutes. And so we'll meet back in this room at 1:30 for the breakout sessions to begin. Thank you.